Earlier this afternoon, the federal government announced their 2021 budget, and so I'd like to share some of my reactions to it with you and also to invite, if you've got reflections and reactions to share, please feel free to do so in the comments. First, on the positives, I'm really encouraged to see a commitment to a national universal childcare program in this budget. Specifically, it's a $30 billion commitment over the next 5 years, followed by just over $8 billion a year thereafter. It's modeled after what we know has worked in Quebec, and follows through on a promise that Liberal governments have been making since the early 1990s. The proposal, while it still requires negotiation with the provinces and the territories, could move us towards $10 a day childcare by 2026. And we know that this works. Labor participation rates in Quebec amongst women are 4 percentage points higher than the rest of the country. And so at a time when we know women continue to shoulder more of the responsibilities around childcare across the country, and when we know that so many parents are struggling, particularly in the midst of this pandemic, between the mix of working full-time, parenting full-time, and even now in a lockdown, in some cases teaching full-time, this is a needed support right across the country. In addition, I'm also really encouraged to see that rent and wage subsidies that were due to end at the end of June have been extended. There's a $12 billion commitment to extend those at least until the end of September. And I know for so many I've been speaking with the last few months, this has been a real point of anxiety. And so I'm glad to see these commitments extended. While, of course, we need more, for example, at the provincial level around paid sick days, at least from a federal point of view, I'm glad to see these commitments continued. When it comes to some of my concerns around the budget, the overarching theme is that this is a government that's been making a lot of lofty promises over many years and has continued to kick the can down the road to future generations on many of these promises that relate to priorities that I heard from so many of our neighbors over the course of knocking on thousands of doors in 2019, and even more so in the time since. I'll start with housing first of all. There is a 1% vacancy tax for non-Canadian residents that would start in January of 2022 in this budget. And there's also a $1.5 billion additional investment in rapid housing. But the reality is, for the extent of the housing crises that we face, these commitments are really just a drop in the bucket. After speaking with dozens of experts over the last number of months in particular, it's abundantly clear some of the very clear policy solutions that are required. I wrote a blog about it just last Friday. If you'd like to hear more, I'll be on Facebook Live on Wednesday night chatting with a number of experts about it. In short, we need to be putting significant investment in non-market housing, whether that's subsidized, co-op housing. We need to be looking at beyond how that could add to the supply of affordable housing in terms of cooling an overheated market. Whether it's looking at supporting municipalities with inclusionary zoning, or looking to end the blind bidding process on real estate. There's so much that this government could be doing as it relates at the federal level on housing. In addition to housing, there are significant other promises that have been made that are not followed through on here. The first is on Pharmacare. We've had a commitment from this government since 1997 to institute universal Pharmacare for our neighbors across Kitchener. I know that the number of people in our community that are having to make tough choices between paying for hydro or for the high cost of pharmaceuticals, people are in really difficult positions. And so what is in this budget? There is $500 million for high-cost drugs for rare diseases. But when it comes to moving forward on a commitment to universal pharmaceutical coverage, we claim to have universal healthcare in this country. The fact is there are significant gaps. This is one of them, and it's not in this budget. Another is around a guaranteed livable income. I was encouraged to see members of the Liberal Party just a few weeks ago overwhelmingly vote in support of a guaranteed livable income. I know across our community, whether I'm talking with seniors who are concerned about increased cost of living, students who are considering additional upgrading of skills, and students at all ages of life, those that are on a patchwork of social assistance programs. The list goes on and on, that we need a guaranteed livable income, and there's nothing in this budget that would move us towards that. Another pressing priority is around mental health. And this is even before the pandemic, that the calls were going out far and wide that we need to treat mental health as health, and we need to be investing in it as such. In this budget, there are small items. There's $45 million, for example, to develop national mental health service standards. But when it comes to the transformational changes we need to be deeply investing in the mental health of our neighbors, that's not in this budget, and I really was hoping that it would be. And again, particularly in the pandemic, when we know things have only gotten worse, there's been such a focus on the reality of the challenges around mental health that this pandemic has exacerbated. Finally, there's a real need to be addressing wealth inequality across the country that I was hoping this budget would take on, that I'm not seeing. And so while some will critique around debt, we know that the debt to GDP ratio in our country has risen from just over 30 to just over 50%, but it's still amongst the lowest of any country in the G7. As we look at some of these transformational investments, though, we don't only need to be looking at potential increases to our debt burden. We should also be looking at leveraging ways we could be addressing wealth inequality. Here's a number of options. Number one, last year we tripled our subsidies to the fossil fuel sector to $18 billion a year. And in this budget, there are additional investments proposed in the billions of allocated financial supports and tax credits for high emitting sectors. These are the billions of dollars we could and should be using, whether it's taking decisive action on climate change or on some of the pressing priorities I mentioned earlier. In addition, we know that in the time of the pandemic, billionaires across the country have seen their wealth balloon, an increase in 40% in the last year alone amongst the 4 dozen or so billionaires across the country. A Liberal MP had even proposed a one-time wealth tax that would bring in $70 billion a year, let alone anything that might be an annual revenue source in years after. There's no talk of that in this budget. We're also the only country in the G7 that has yet to move forward on any thresholds of any kind around an inheritance tax that would look at large wealth transfers and ensuring that could also help to address some of the wealth inequality across the country. And so there's no shortage of ways we could be looking at ensuring we're pragmatic about both addressing wealth inequality and investing in some of these transformational social programs that we need. If the goal of this budget was to avoid triggering an election, I expect this will do it. However, if the goal of the budget was what it should be, which is addressing the priorities of Canadians across the country, then I think this really misses the mark. And really what it's proposing is, save for a few highlights, universal childcare being one of them, it misses the mark. And this is a time when we, more than ever, we can be doing better. Would love to hear some of your reactions and reflections as well. Like I mentioned earlier, please feel free to share those in the comments.